The grand ballroom of the 7-star Grand Continental Hotel was a suffocating sea of gold, crystal, and silk, vibrating with the city's most dangerous elite. The air was heavy, cloying with the scent of expensive perfume and the sharp, jagged sting of whispered secrets. Sophie, a young, unassuming waitress, knelt on the cold, polished marble to clean up shimmering shards of glass. Vanessa, the CEO's girlfriend, sauntered by and deliberately kicked the tray. Champagne drenched Sophie's uniform. Vanessa grabbed the soaked fabric and ripped it, sneering at her. The ballroom went dead silent. Then, the heavy oak doors swung open. Who did this to my daughter? Sophie Harrison was 24. To the outside world, she was merely a ghost in the machine of the Grand Continental, a part-time server working grueling, thankless shifts. She was gentle, resilient, and possessed an unwavering, genuine smile, even when her feet throbbed from standing for 12 hours. She resided in a cramped, drafty studio apartment, relied on the city bus, and counted every single penny. But beneath her polyester uniform beat the heart of someone who understood exactly what true, hollow wealth looked like. Sophie was the only daughter of Richard Harrison, the absolute titan behind the legendary Harrison Group. But 6 years ago, she had severed the golden tether. After her mother's tragic passing, Richard had retreated into a cold, clinical obsession with his empire, burying his grief under mountains of balance sheets, acquisitions, and ruthless corporate mergers. To Richard, love was a transactional asset that had already been spent. To Sophie, home had become a decorative, haunting museum of opulence where she was essentially a display piece. At 18, she had left a short, handwritten note on her father's mahogany desk, cut all ties, and vanished into the city's sprawling anonymity. She craved the raw dignity of being seen for her own efforts, not the exorbitant trust fund she stood upon. She wanted to know who she was when stripped of the velvet-lined luxury that had defined her childhood. She didn't want to be a Harrison. She wanted to be a person. She wanted to test the friction of the real world, to see if her own character could spark a flame without the acceleration of inherited power. Daniel Carter, the young, ambitious CEO of the Grand Continental, was a man of cold, surgical logic and impeccably tailored suits. He was fair to his staff in a distant, bureaucratic way, but he was perpetually distracted by the crushing weight of keeping his hotel afloat in a Shark Tank economy. He was the architect of a crumbling facade. He had no inkling of the rot festering within his own inner circle, nor did he realize that the very people he treated as expendable were the ones holding his empire together. His girlfriend, Vanessa, was a high-fashion model with a venomous, predatory streak. She treated anyone in a service role as mere furniture, or worse, obstacles to be cleared. To Vanessa, the waitstaff were invisible, mere background props in the grand, self-centered theater of her own social climbing. She thrived on the humiliation of those she deemed beneath her, using it as a sick form of entertainment to distract from her own deep-seated insecurities. Daniel had noticed Sophie a few times. He had seen her helping a tired, elderly colleague clear a heavy table, or kneeling to scrub a stubborn stain from the carpet before an important guest could slip. He simply thought, "She's a diligent worker." He had absolutely no idea that behind those quiet, professional eyes was a woman who technically held a majority stake in the very ground he walked on. Sophie's secret was her sanctuary. She didn't want the suffocating prestige of her father's name. She wanted the liberation of being recognized for her own grit. She rode the bus, not because she was forced to, but because it served as a grounding reminder that the world was far larger than the gated estates of her past. The irony was suffocating. The woman he viewed as a nameless servant was, in truth, the only person in the building who truly understood the price of the power he spent his life chasing. The preparations for the annual charity gala were a logistical nightmare. The Grand Continental was under a microscope with the city's most elite figures, the kind who owned banks, shaped policies, and bought politicians for lunch, descending upon the hotel. For Sophie, this meant 16-hour shifts, feet swollen inside cheap, uncomfortable shoes, and a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. Daniel was under immense pressure. The hotel's quarterly revenue was dipping, and he was terrified that one misstep at this gala would spell his professional doom. He moved through the lobby like a man haunted, checking schedules, briefing staff, and desperately trying to keep the chaotic veneer of luxury from cracking. It was during one of these frantic rehearsals that he saw Sophie again. She was helping an elderly headwaiter, Marcus, carry a massive tray of fine crystal that he clearly couldn't handle on his own. She didn't complain. She didn't seek credit. She just slid in, took the weight, and smiled a warm, genuine smile that seemed entirely out of place in the sterile, high-tension atmosphere of the hotel. Daniel stopped for a moment, caught off guard. He had become so used to the performative, transactional nature of the wealthy donors, he catered to that he had forgotten what simple, unpretentious kindness looked like. "You're working hard," Daniel said, his voice surprisingly soft. Sophie looked up, her eyes clear and unfazed by his presence. "Hard work is part of the job, Mr. Carter. It's what makes the evening special for our guests." Daniel was struck by the intelligence in her gaze. It wasn't the subservient, glassy-eyed look of a worker hoping for a promotion. It was the steady, observant gaze of a peer. He wanted to say more, to ask what someone like her was doing working such a grueling job, but Vanessa swept in at that moment, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble. "Daniel, stop chatting with the staff," Vanessa snapped, not even bothering to glance at Sophie. "We have a meeting with the caterers. Come on." Daniel sighed, the moment of connection severed. He gave Sophie a small, apologetic nod and walked away. Vanessa cast a sharp, dismissive look at Sophie, her eyes narrowing with a flash of unexplained disdain. She didn't know who Sophie was, but she hated the way Daniel looked at her, as if he were seeing a person rather than an object. Sophie continued her work, unfazed. She knew how to disappear into the background. She was a master of being invisible. She had practiced it for 6 years. Later that evening, while the hotel was finally quiet, Sophie found herself in the quiet corner of the service hallway, carefully mending a tear in her uniform. She didn't want to show up to the gala looking anything less than professional. She held the small, tarnished silver locket around her neck, her mother's locket. It was the only piece of her former life she allowed herself to keep. It reminded her of where she came from and why she had chosen to leave. She heard a commotion in the kitchen. A young kitchen porter, barely 20, had accidentally dropped a sauce pot. The sous chef was screaming at him, his face purple, his verbal abuse stinging and cruel. Sophie walked in, her presence calm, her voice steady. "The floor was slick from the earlier spill," Sophie said, stepping between the chef and the terrified boy. "It was an accident. I saw it happen." The chef bristled, but the calm authority in Sophie's voice made him stop. The boy looked at her, his eyes wide with gratitude. Sophie just gave him a quick, encouraging wink and handed him a mop. Throughout the next few days, these small moments of grace repeated. Sophie was everywhere, a silent guardian in a den of sharks. She was the one who quietly slipped a glass of water to the exhausted housekeeper who was nearing a panic attack. She was the one who carefully wiped the smudges off the display cases before the VIPs arrived. She was the one who stayed late to finish the work of those who had been unfairly treated. Daniel watched her from the periphery. He was becoming increasingly aware of her presence, not because she drew attention to herself, but because she was the quiet, invisible engine that kept his failing hotel from collapsing into total dysfunction. He started to feel a strange, gnawing guilt. He was the one who set the policies that allowed such cruelty to flourish in his kitchen. He was the one who let Vanessa dictate the mood of his personal life, and by extension, his management style. One evening, he saw Sophie in the lobby, sitting on a bench during her short break. She was reading a worn, dog-eared copy of a classic novel. He walked over, feeling a strange pull. "That's a difficult book," he remarked. Sophie looked up, her expression bright. "It's a study of the human condition. It reminds me that no matter how much money or power someone has, we all carry the same burdens." Daniel sat down beside her, the distance between the CEO and the server narrowing. "You sound like someone who has seen a lot of the world, Sophie." She smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. I've seen enough to know that the most powerful people are often the most afraid. That conversation haunted Daniel. He realized he was afraid of failing, afraid of his own lack of purpose, afraid of the hollow existence he had built for himself. Sophie, on the other hand, was fearless. She had nothing to lose because she had chosen to own nothing. Vanessa, meanwhile, was watching. Her jealousy was a corrosive, living thing. She began to view Sophie not as a waitress, but as a threat. She couldn't understand why the man she intended to control was becoming increasingly introspective, distracted, and distant. She saw the way he watched the service staff, the way he lingered in the lobby, the way he seemed to be searching for something he couldn't name. Vanessa's mind, fueled by insecurity and entitlement, turned its venom toward the one person who seemed to capture Daniel's attention. She decided that Sophie needed to be taught a lesson. She needed to be reminded of her place. The gala was the perfect stage. It was where the world would be watching, and it was where Vanessa would ensure that the hierarchy was firmly and cruelly established. She began to plot, her smile tightening, her eyes turning cold. She didn't know that she was playing with fire, and that the waitress she intended to destroy was a ghost from a past she was entirely unprepared to face. Sophie, oblivious to the storm brewing, went about her work with the quiet dignity of a woman who had already weathered the worst life could throw at her. She didn't know that her past was about to collide with her present in a way that would rewrite the future of the entire Grand Continental. The gala was the pinnacle of the season. The ballroom of the Grand Continental was a blinding cathedral of light, crystal chandeliers dripping with diamonds, orchestras playing haunting, rhythmic melodies that echoed against the marble, and the city's most elite figures mingling in a sea of champagne and vanity. Vanessa moved through the room like a predator, her gaze constantly searching for a target, her dress a shimmering, liquid gold that cost more than most people earned in a year. She was fueled by a cocktail of champagne and a toxic jealousy that had been festering for days. She needed to strike. She needed to break the quiet, untouchable grace that Sophie seemed to carry everywhere. She spotted Sophie near the edge of the service line, her posture perfect, her face a mask of polite, efficient professionalism. Vanessa signaled for her. Her voice was a sharp, jagged whip that cut through the conversation of the nearby donors. "You, the girl with the locket, come here." Sophie approached, her heart heavy, knowing this would not end well. "Yes, Ms. Vanessa? Is there something you need?" "I need you to be competent for once," Vanessa sneered. She waited until Sophie was inches away. Then, with a calculated, fluid motion, she tilted her wine glass, dumping the dark, acidic liquid directly onto the floor, and then shoved the glass against Sophie's hip so it shattered, wine splashing upward onto Vanessa's own hem. The sound of the glass hitting the floor was like a gunshot in the silent room. Vanessa let out a shrill, piercing scream that brought the ballroom to a dead standstill. "Look at what you've done!" she shrieked, her face contorted in a mask of practiced, theatrical rage. "You clumsy, miserable wretch! You ruined my custom-made gown!" Sophie stood frozen, her eyes wide. I didn't touch your glass, Ms. Vanessa. You! Don't you dare lie to me!" Vanessa slapped her across the face, the sound echoing throughout the room. It was a vicious, stinging blow that left a red mark blooming on Sophie's cheek. Then, as if to cement the humiliation, Vanessa lunged forward and grabbed the bodice of Sophie's simple uniform, ripping the fabric with a guttural, primal grunt of malice. The uniform tore, exposing the white shirt beneath. Sophie shielded herself, her breath hitching in her throat, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The shame was a cold, suffocating weight. She was surrounded by the elite, by the very people who had looked down on her father, and now they were looking down on her. "Someone get this pathetic girl out of my sight," Vanessa commanded, looking around for validation from the crowd. Daniel pushed his way through the gathering circle, his face a storm of confusion and mounting anger. "What is going on here? She ruined my dress, Daniel. She's been nothing but trouble all night." "Staring at you? Hovering, trying to get attention," Vanessa sobbed, clinging to his arm. Daniel looked at Sophie. He saw the torn uniform, the red handprint on her face, and the quiet, devastating dignity in her posture despite the wreckage around her. He started to speak, his voice cold and commanding, but the sound of the double doors being thrown open silenced him entirely. The rhythm of the room shifted. A tall, imposing figure stepped into the ballroom, Richard Harrison. The billionaire investor was known as the Ice King for his ruthless, impenetrable demeanor. He stood in the entryway, his eyes scanning the room, cold as the Arctic Sea, until they landed on the shivering, broken figure of the waitress near the service table. His eyes locked onto the small, tarnished silver locket around her neck. Time seemed to stop. His face, usually a mask of corporate stoicism, cracked. A flash of raw, unfiltered agony and recognition crossed his features. He didn't run. He walked with a slow, terrifying intent, his security detail falling in behind him like shadows. The guests parted, terrified, sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure. Richard reached the center of the scene, his eyes never leaving Sophie. He stopped, took off his heavy, hand-stitched suit jacket, and draped it gently over her shoulder. "Who?" Richard said, his voice a low, gravel-heavy vibration that could be felt in the floorboards. "Did this? To my daughter?" The word daughter hung in the air, shattering the room. Vanessa's face drained of all color, her mouth dropping open in a silent, terrified gasp. Daniel, standing just feet away, felt as if he had been punched in the solar plexus. The woman he had been watching from afar, the woman he had admired for her grace and grit, was the sole heiress of the Harrison empire. Richard turned his gaze to Vanessa. It wasn't the look of a man who was angry. It was the look of a man deciding a business's fate. "You seem to have an issue with clothing, young lady, but you have a much larger issue with humanity." He waved his hand, and his assistant stepped forward, projecting a high-definition video onto the large screen behind the stage. It was the security footage, crystal clear. It showed Vanessa deliberately pouring the wine, breaking the glass, and tearing the fabric of her own dress before attacking Sophie. The truth, cold and incontrovertible, played out for every guest to see. Vanessa's knees gave way. She looked at Daniel, hoping for a lifeline, but Daniel wouldn't even look at her. He was watching Richard, who was now holding Sophie's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles with a tenderness no one in the business world knew he possessed. "You are done," Richard said to Vanessa, his voice final. "Not just here, not in this city, and certainly not in this man's hotel." The revelation rippled through the elite crowd, a frantic buzz of whispers and cell phone camera flashes. Vanessa, once the queen of the social scene, was now a pariah, caught on tape committing an act of malice that even the most corrupt mogul could not ignore. She scrambled to find her voice, but Richard's security had already stepped forward, their presence a physical wall between her and her audience. Richard did not raise his voice again. He didn't have to. The power of his reputation, combined with the visceral reality of the video proof, rendered her influence obsolete. Vanessa was escorted out, not with the grace of a model, but with the shuffling, defeated gait of someone who had just lost everything she built her fragile ego upon. Daniel stood in the silence that followed, watching the man who could buy and sell his hotel with a single phone call. He was terrified for the future, but even more than that, he was deeply, profoundly ashamed. He had built a facade of luxury, but he had allowed it to be inhabited by monsters. As Sophie stood beside her father, her posture shifting from that of a victim to someone finally anchored by the love she had denied herself for 6 long years, Daniel felt the weight of his own insignificance. He had lost his direction, but looking at Sophie now, he finally saw the lighthouse. The aftermath was a blur of police reports, hushed apologies, and the swift, silent removal of Vanessa from the social strata she had once dominated. Within an hour, her modeling agency had dropped her, and her social media accounts were being flooded with the truth. She left the hotel in a taxi, alone, stripped of the influence she had used to terrorize those she deemed beneath her. But the cleanup at the Grand Continental was far more extensive. For Daniel, the gala was a wake-up call that hit with the force of a wrecking ball. He spent the next 48 hours reviewing every department, every internal memo, and every disciplinary record. He discovered that the bullying wasn't limited to Vanessa. The culture of the hotel had become rot-infested, a direct reflection of his own obsession with the bottom line. He had been so focused on the survival of the business that he had forgotten to be a human being, let alone a leader. He found Sophie in the quiet staff lounge, where she had been waiting for her father's security team to finish clearing the building. She was sitting in a dim corner, the locket held tight in her hand. Daniel approached, but he didn't sit. He stood, keeping a respectful distance, his head bowed. "I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," Daniel said, his voice ragged. "I let this happen. I created the environment where someone like that felt she could treat you or anyone like garbage. I looked at you for months, Sophie, and I saw a worker. I never saw the person. I failed you. I failed my staff." Sophie looked up. The red mark on her cheek was fading, but the hurt was still visible in her eyes. "You didn't cause her cruelty, Daniel. That came from inside her. But you did allow it to grow in the shade of your office. And that is what you need to fix." "I am," Daniel promised. "I've already terminated the managers who turned a blind eye to the harassment. I'm implementing a completely new leadership structure, one that prioritizes the dignity of the person over the efficiency of the task. I want you to know, Sophie, I didn't want to get to know you because of who your father was. I wanted to get to know you because, for the first time in my life, I met someone who made me feel like I was talking to an equal." Sophie let out a soft, tired laugh. "We're all equals, Daniel. The only thing that changes is the clothes we wear." Across the hallway, Richard was standing near the door, observing the exchange. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret. For years, he had tried to keep his daughter in a cage of gold, and when she broke out, he had been too proud to follow her. He had watched her from a distance, saw her struggling, saw her working, and he had been waiting for her to come to her senses. He realized now that the only person who had lost their senses was him. He walked over, and for the first time in years, Richard Harrison looked vulnerable. "Sophie," he began, his voice breaking, "I was wrong. I spent all my time building a future for you, only to destroy your present. I don't expect you to come back home. I don't expect you to take the company. But I hope you'll let me be a father again, even if it's just for coffee on Sunday." Sophie stood up and walked to him. She didn't hug him, but she placed her hand on his arm. It was the start. "I'd like that, Dad." The process of restoration was not instantaneous. It was slow, painful, and required a complete re-evaluation of every procedure in the hotel. Daniel worked alongside his staff not as a remote commander, but as a participant. He learned the names of the cleaners, the kitchen porters, and the night shift security guards. He saw the resilience of people like Sophie, who had been holding the structure together despite the environment. He realized that the grand in Grand Continental had meant nothing if it didn't include the grand humanity of those working within it. Every week, he and Sophie met not to talk about the hotel, but to discuss the progress of the culture change. In those moments, he wasn't the CEO, and she wasn't the heiress. They were two people committed to making a broken place whole again. 1 year later, the Grand Continental was a different entity entirely. It was no longer just a hotel. It was a beacon for ethical business practices. The staff turnover had plummeted, and morale was at an all-time high. Sophie had not returned to her father's empire in the way he had once dreamed, but she had become a vital consultant for the Grand Continental, helping Daniel bridge the gap between management and labor. On a sunny Saturday, Daniel invited Sophie to a small, private dinner on the hotel rooftop. The air was cool, smelling of night-blooming jasmine. They sat by the edge of the terrace, looking out over the city lights. "I was offered a position at the Harrison Group last week," Daniel said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Your father offered me a CEO role in his tech division. It would be 10 times the salary, 10 times the prestige." Sophie looked at him, her heart beating a little faster. And I realized," Daniel smiled, "that I'd rather be here, fixing the broken things, than running a giant machine where I can't see the faces of the people I'm building for."
"I'm staying, Sophie."
"I'm staying with you." Sophie leaned back, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known since she was a child. She pulled out her locket, the metal warm against her palm. She had kept the torn uniform, not as a symbol of shame, but as a reminder. It was framed in her small, now refurbished apartment. A reminder that no amount of money or power could ever make one person superior to another. The story of the waitress who became a queen had gone viral, but the reality was far more profound. She wasn't a queen. She was a woman who had dared to be vulnerable, and in doing so, she had changed the hearts of two of the most powerful men in the city. Richard sat in his office, his desk empty of the endless reports that had once consumed his life. He was looking at a photograph of Sophie and Daniel, taken at the garden he had donated to the city in her mother's honor. He had learned the ultimate lesson. You cannot force someone to be who you want them to be. You can only give them the space to grow into who they are. As the sun set, casting long golden shadows across the city, the Grand Continental stood tall. Not because of its gold or its crystal, but because of the people inside who now felt truly seen. Sophie smiled, sipping her coffee, the sound of the city fading into a gentle, rhythmic hum. She had found her place not by inheriting it, but by building it one act of kindness at a time. The heir to a fortune had realized that the greatest treasure wasn't the empire she could run, but the life she had chosen to live. One where every role mattered, every person had value, and where, finally, she was exactly who she was meant to be. The cycle of arrogance had been broken, and in its place, a new era of genuine respect had finally taken root. Status may cause others to bow before you, but only kindness earns their genuine respect. The value of a human being lies not in the clothes they wear or the job they perform, but in the way they treat those less fortunate than themselves.